The Eldar have never been the most popular faction in Warhammer 40k. They've got a great aesthetic and an interesting backstory, but despite the fact that there are plenty of people who like to play as them on the tabletop game, in terms of story, no one really likes the Eldar. This is down to two factors. The first is that, except when they're fighting the Guard or the Tau, the Eldar are almost always the ones getting beaten up. Second, when they aren't being everyone else's punching bag, the Eldar are constantly sneering at everyone, especially the humans, at just how inferior they are and just how perfect and wonderful they themselves are. Assuming you ever found an Eldar that was willing to demean himself by speaking in low Gothic, he would wax long about the many sins of humanity, all while sanctimoniously ignoring the many crimes his own race has committed, which in fact arguably are some of the worst. Not even the Necrons, who literally sold their souls to evil star vampires for some shiny new bodies, can claim anything equivalent to the singular dishonor of allowing your civilization to fall into such depravity that you psychically give birth to a god of spiked sex toys. Of course, the fact that Black Library has published very few books portraying the Eldar in a sympathetic or even likable way certainly hasn't helped. So, what happens when you take the biggest loser faction in 40k and discover that there are even bigger losers among them? Well, you get the subject of today's video. The most underused Eldar faction in the entire universe. So underused that they don't have their own army. So unappreciated, in fact, that they have almost no fan art to speak of, and this entire video is mostly comprised of pictures of models. They are the Exodites. As with all Eldar, the story of the Exodites begins with the decline and fall of the Eldar Empire. Like the Craftworld Eldar, the ancestors of the Exodites were able to perceive the slow but inevitable degradation of Eldar civilization. And once they realized that there was no way to stop it, they, like the Craftworlders, decided to leave. But where the Craftworlders fled aboard their namesake space vessels, the Exodites instead migrated to planets on the fringes of Eldar space known as Maiden Worlds. Because these planets were so far out of the way, the Exodites mostly survived the fall unscathed, and like the rest of their shattered race, built their new society around the idea of trying to avoid falling into the same mistakes as their forebears. The way the Exodites saw it, the fall of the Eldar was the result of indolence. At the height of their civilization, the Eldar had known peace and prosperity unequaled by any other species before or since. It got to the point where they didn't even have to fight or do menial labor themselves, and so could just lie around doing whatever they pleased. This, of course, had led to boredom and a desire for stimulus, which is why the sensation cults were so popular in the first place. To the Exodites, the fall proved the old biblical saying that idle hands are the devil's workshop. Thus, to avoid such a thing from happening again, the Exodites decided to forego most of the technology that had given their race such easy living and dedicate themselves to hard, honest toil. Essentially, they became the Amish of 40k. Wraithbone constructs, automatons, and any of the other labor-saving devices that the Craftworlders use, thus freeing themselves to focus on their paths, is utterly disdained by the Exodites. They haven't forgotten how to use Eldar technology, they simply choose not to use it. Their lives are harder and simpler than that of the Craftworlders, but to their minds more spiritually fulfilling. But that's not to say that the Exodites use no technology whatsoever. They may farm their own fields, harvest timber, and mine with their own two hands, but the harshness of the 41st millennium requires that they use at least some forms of technology to protect themselves. Like the Craftworlders, the Exodites rely on spirit stones to protect their souls from the ever-hungering grasp of Slaanesh. Once recovered, the Exodite Spirit Stone is then brought to a so-called World Shrine, one of several psycho-crystalline structures that usually dot an Eldar maiden world. These world shrines are in turn psychically linked into a massive network that essentially functions like a Craftworld's infinity circuit. The Exodite's Spirit Stone is then broken open, and the soul of the Exodite in question enters into the World Shrine and joins with this network, known as the World Spirit. The other kind of technology still utilized by the Exodites is that of military hardware. Exodites will use armor and weapons like laser rifles and power swords, but they firmly draw the line at vehicles like tanks and airplanes. Instead, they use a combination of mind control harnesses and psychic mental manipulation to use dangerous megafauna as war mounts. This is the reason why pretty much all depictions of Exodites usually involve them riding what are essentially space dinosaurs. It's pretty much what the Exodites are known for. And of course, like most other Eldar, the Exodites make extensive use of their psychic abilities when it comes to defending their home. The most noteworthy Exodite psychers are the so-called World Singers. Psychers in tune with both the local world spirit and the forces of nature on that particular planet. A World Singer can summon storms, call on local predators to fight enemies, and even manipulate plant life as a weapon. And that's pretty much all there is to say about the Exodites, as they are, once again, the most neglected and underappreciated faction in all of Warhammer 40k. And honestly, it makes absolutely no sense to me. As I and many others have doubtless said before, 40k is an incredibly over-the-top universe, so the idea of psychic space elves riding dinosaurs wouldn't exactly be out of place. In fact, it's one of the cooler ideas in this entire lore. And yet the Exodites get no attention or love. At all. They don't have their own codex in the tabletop, they're usually just lumped in with the Craftworld Eldar. And in the lore, they have almost no stories in which they are the focus. Every Eldar story that has been written, and these are few in and of themselves, are either the Craftworld Eldar, the Dark Eldar, or the Harlequins. Despite scouring the internet, I haven't been able to find any reason as to why this is so, and can only write this off as the ultimate wasted opportunity in Games Workshop's history. Well, at least one of them anyway. What little is known about the Exodites usually implies that because of their rustic lifestyle, they are much more grounded and far less arrogant than the rest of the Eldar race. A storyline involving the Exodites could give the Eldar that much-needed boost in sympathy and likability that I talked about at the beginning of this video. So come on, Games Workshop, get someone at Black Library to write that story. But there's little point in yelling into the vacuum. So, in order to keep this video from being insultingly short, I'm going to talk about the Maiden Worlds that the Exodites live on, as they are the greatest hope of the Eldar race as a whole, but also their greatest weakness. Maiden Worlds, you see, are formerly barren and lifeless planets that the Eldar began terraforming in the latter days of their empire. The terraforming process itself usually took thousands of years to make a world habitable, glacially slow by human standards, but compared to the millions or even billions of years it usually takes, remarkably fast. After 10,000 years, most of these worlds have gone from barren rocks to lush, vibrant worlds filled with life, what the Imperium would categorize as paradise worlds. With the original worlds of the Eldar Empire, the so-called Crown Worlds, having been consumed by the Eye of Terror, the Eldar consider the Maiden Worlds to be their birthright and the only remnants of their former civilization. Unfortunately, since the Eldar have spent 10,000 years simply trying to stay alive, they haven't been able to keep track of all of their Maiden Worlds, and while most are populated by Exodites, several have been colonized by other races, notably the Imperium of Man. Often these populations will have lived on the Maiden World for centuries or even millennia, long before any Eldar had ever set foot there. But as far as the Eldar are concerned, the colonists are invaders, and they, especially the Craftworld Eldar, will dedicate a lot of time, effort, and resources to expunging the Maiden Worlds of the alien interlopers, sometimes to the point of extermination, should it be feasible. The Eldar in general, and especially the Craftworlders and the Exodites, place a lot of value on the Maiden Worlds. For the Exodites especially, this can be very dangerous. The Eldar are few in number, especially compared to factions like the Orcs, Tyranids, and the Imperium of Man. As such, their greatest asset is their mobility, the ability to simply disappear into the vast reaches of space when their enemies come to wipe them out. The Craft Worlds, of course, are constantly on the move, while the Dark Eldar and the Harlequins make extensive use of the webway, essentially hitting where they need to hit and then fading away before the enemy can retaliate. By establishing their settlements, and more importantly their world shrines on the Maiden Worlds, the Exodites have made the tactically dangerous move of fixing themselves in one position. This is further compounded by the fact that the Exodites are a stubborn breed and usually refuse to run away when their Maiden Worlds are discovered, as fleeing would not only mean abandoning their homes, but also their world shrines and the spirits of their ancestors. Unsurprisingly, therefore, the Exodites' best defense is often to remain unnoticed. Most Maiden Worlds are situated in remote, isolated regions of the galaxy, well out of the way of most interstellar traffic. Plus, in the 10,000 years since the fall, most Exodite settlements have made arrangements with the craft worlds for protection. A craft world will patrol the local region of space in which a Maiden World is situated, and should an enemy come snooping around, the craft world will attack said enemy and try to draw them away, thus ensuring that the Maiden World and the Exodites remain undiscovered. However, things have become increasingly precarious for the Eldar race as a whole. With the Silent King rallying the ancient Necron enemy and increased depredations by Chaos and the Tyranids, it has become an open question of whether or not the Exodites can continue to live their low-tech existence for much longer. Still, the Eldar have at least come to something of an understanding with the Imperium, so for the time being at least they have one less enemy to worry about. Still, the future of the galaxy has become increasingly grim for the various sentient races of the galaxy. Whether or not the Exodites can continue to live as they have is a question that only time can answer.